So I'm excited to invite all of you to join me in this study. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to say the blessing for study together. And then we're going to talk about Abraham Joshua Heschel, his understanding of prophecy and of social justice. So let's join together in the blessing for study. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu laasok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the Eternal, whose mitzvot make our lives holy, and who commands us to immerse ourselves, to engage ourselves, laasok, in words of Torah. So here's Abraham Joshua Heschel, a name that I'm sure is familiar to all of you, or else you wouldn't be here. You're all seeing my screen, right? Everybody see my screen? Okay, good. Excellent. I'm going to give a very brief bio of Abraham Joshua Heschel, because even though he's an important name, not all of us know a whole lot about him. And I think in some ways his background will help to shape the conversation that we're going to be having about prophecy and social justice in this conversation. So Heschel's dates are, he was born in 1907. He died in 1972, unfortunately way too young at the age of 66. And just by way of a few things that are interesting and important to know about Heschel, I like to joke that Abraham Joshua Heschel is maybe one of the few Jews that manages to be Reformed, conservative, and Orthodox all at the same time. Heschel was born in Warsaw, at least in the Warsaw area, and he was, by all rights, he should have been a Hasidic Rebbe. Heschel was the scion of a number of generations of Hasidic Rebbes. He traced his lineage back to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. And in fact, Heschel was ordained a rabbi at the age of 16 in his Orthodox Hasidic world. He was a genius. There's no question that he was a rabbinic genius in all kinds of ways. But Heschel was not satisfied to remain in that world. He left the Hasidic Orthodox world that he grew up in order to pursue different ways of understanding Judaism. And so as a young man, Heschel made his way ultimately to Berlin to study at the University of Berlin, and at the same time at the liberal seminary, what's called the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, which is to say the Center for the Scientific Study of Judaism, which is the name by which the liberal seminary was known in those days. And through his studies there, Heschel was double ordained. He was ordained a Reform rabbi after already having been ordained an Orthodox rabbi at the age of 16. Heschel did so because he wanted to study Jewish texts through a critical lens. He wanted to understand where texts come from, who wrote them, how they work together. But Heschel never really fit in Reform Judaism, just as he never exactly fit in his Hasidic orthodoxy. He ultimately made his way, and I'm obviously telescoping this quite a bit, Heschel ultimately made his way to the United States. He was one of only 6 scholars that were saved from Nazi Europe in the late 30s, 6 months before the Germans invaded Poland. He was invited by the Hebrew Union College, the Reformed Seminary in Cincinnati, to come to Cincinnati to teach there. It was part of HUC's effort to save a few scholars from Nazi Europe, and Heschel was one of them. He taught at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati for a couple of years, but never really fit in there, and ultimately made his way to New York to teach at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative movement's rabbinical seminary, where he taught several generations of conservative rabbis. So like I said, Reform, Orthodox, and conservative all at the same time, because Heschel never really fit exactly into any of those worlds, and he never really abandoned any of those worlds either. He embodied really this sense that Jews don't need to put themselves into boxes, into buckets, and that Judaism is very much about, well, as we'll see in a few moments, about awe, about joy in human life, and about social justice. Heschel, in his life in America, he had sort of 2 periods. There was his writing period and his civil activism period. In the 50s, he wrote a number of books that you might have heard of, including The Sabbath, Man is Not Alone, God in Search of Man, some of his philosophical and theological works. Those were mostly published in the 50s. And in the 60s, Heschel turned his attention really towards social activism. So that's where you've seen famous pictures of him marching with Martin Luther King, for example, speaking at high-profile civil rights events. For him, that was a religious act. And that's really what we're here to talk about today, is the way that that became an expression of religious thinking, that social justice became an expression of religious thinking for Abraham Joshua Heschel. So I want to start by showing you two stories, really short snippets from the biography of Heschel that's called Spiritual Radical. Oh, before I do that, here is the link in case you want to follow along. Here is the link for the source sheet that I'm using. I'll share my screen the whole time, but in case you would like to, did it go? In case you would like to have the sources in front of you, you can log into that link and you'll be able to see what we're looking at. So let me show you two stories. And I want to ask you to engage with me in understanding or figuring out what do these two stories say about Heschel and his approach to Judaism. One from his time at Hebrew Union College in the 40s when he was teaching Reform rabbinical students, and one from his time at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the 50s. I don't know exactly when this story takes place, when he was teaching conservative rabbinical students. And these are both, like I said, taken from his biography, which was put together from interviews with his many students. It won't surprise you to learn Heschel had acolytes wherever he went. Okay, so this, by the way, is a picture of Heschel sitting on the steps at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, my alma mater. I was there a few years after Heschel was there, but I did once try to take a picture of myself recreating that photo in that spot in on the front steps in Cincinnati. It didn't come out quite as good as Heschel's. At any rate, here's the picture, or here's the story. Heschel, it says, could lead receptive students to religious insights. One day he walked into class and said, "Something very great happened today." "What?" asked future Rabbi Albert Plotkin, who, by the way, just total side note for me, Plotkin was my ex-wife's or my kid's mom's childhood rabbi. So, there's sort of like a chain of transmission there. Rabbis learn from rabbis. At any rate, something very great happened today. Future Rabbi Plotkin says, "What?" Heschel said, "The sun rose." "So what?" said Plotkin. Heschel said, "Did you ever see the sunrise?" "No," Plotkin replied. Heschel suggested that the next morning they take a walk. He was demonstrating to the future rabbi how the most mundane event could evoke awe and radical amazement, the fountain of sacred sensitivity. So that's the first story. The next story takes place about 10 years later when Heschel is teaching at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. There's a little bit older picture of Heschel. And we get this story. There were also illuminating classroom moments. The law committee of the conservative movement had recently debated whether gelatin was kosher. Heschel came into class, asked, "Gentlemen, what is your opinion? Is gelatin kosher or not?" The rabbinical students became engrossed in discussion for several minutes. Heschel interrupted, "Gentlemen, can you tell me if the atomic bomb is kosher?" So I want to invite you to respond to these two stories. Let me see if I can get them both into our picture here. What do we learn? What can we learn from the juxtaposition of these two stories? What do we learn about Heschel and his approach to Judaism from these two stories? And you can put it into the chat, or if you'd like, if anybody would like to unmute and tell us briefly what they see here as well. So I see David says, "Stay amazed." Yes, that notion of radical amazement, right? Ordinary miracles, says Amy. Sunrise at the Grand Canyon. Yeah, we're talking about unforgettable amazement, right? And Renee says he leads and shocks. I like that. Jerry, go ahead. You can unmute and share your thoughts with us.
One other thing besides my thoughts is you can enlarge your screen and we can all see better if you click down in the lower right-hand corner. where you see the little screen icon. My observation here is, he's moving from what some people consider mundane, the sun and the sky, to something extremely profound, the atomic bomb and its um, um, unmitigated impact on humanity.
Hmm. It's very interesting, the juxtaposition of sun and atomic bomb, which I had never thought about in juxtaposing these two stories. But there's, the power of God, such as it is, to create light and to create the incredible power of the sun, and then the power of human beings, which I would think must come along with a kind of a responsibility, a social responsibility toward other human beings. If we're going to act like God, then we need to think like God, such as it is. Ira, go ahead.
I think that like when Jacob woke up and said, I did not see it, I did not recognize God, but now I'm in awe. I mean, it seems like a central tenet of Judaism to be in awe. And like in the creation story, I mean, everything is God if you think of it that way. And so we're in a constant struggle to try to connect with God, and seeing things like a sunrise or an ocean or something is a way that we can connect.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. I want to turn you to the way that the biographer describes radical amazement as being the fountain of sacred sensitivity. Sacred sensitivity is really interesting language because to whom, to what are we supposed to be sensitive? Sensitive, of course, to the miracles in the world around us, which is the foundation of radical amazement or awe. But sacred sensitivity is also at the core of social justice, the core of the Jewish idea that we're supposed to care about other people. Alfred put in the chat that the idea that faith begins with awe is central to God in search of man. It absolutely is. Heschel wants us to be radically amazed. And if we are radically amazed, then we will feel a certain responsibility toward the world and toward our fellow inhabitants of the world. I see Anne Silverman. Go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, just to add to the discussion, that the nuclear bomb is man-made and made for the specific intent to destroy people. And,
Right. And
you know,
yes, thank you for that. And juxtapose that to the sun, which is, of course, the source of life. And it's also a reminder that the same basic chemical reaction can destroy or give life, can give life or take life. And so maybe there's something there about responsibility as well. So these ideas of awe and justice, for Heschel, they come together in the person of the prophet. So what we're going to do for the next little while is we're going to study some of Heschel's writings about prophecy. What does prophecy have to do with the topic of this series, which is social justice in our text? So we'll see that for Heschel, the two are intimately related with each other. Heschel understands the prophet as the advocate for justice in the world around us. So we're going to do a little what I like to call good old-fashioned text study. That is to say, I'm going to put some text in front of us, and I want to invite us to react and respond and to learn together with Heschel. These are taken from some of his books, including The Prophets, which is published in the 60s, but The Prophets was actually essentially Heschel's doctoral dissertation. He wrote it in German back in the 30s, and then he fixed it up in the 60s and republished it in English. In some ways, what Heschel has to say about the prophets tells us more about Heschel than it does about the prophets, if you know what I mean. Like anybody, he views prophecy through the lens of how he sees the world. But that's really interesting because it helps us understand how Heschel understands the world that he's living in, which is not so different from the world we're living in. And of course, our ultimate goal here is to understand what can we learn for our world from what Heschel has to say. So this is from Heschel's book, The Prophets, his section on the prophet Amos. He says, the people of Judah had rejected the Torah of the Lord. By the way, I left in all the gendered masculine language because that's how Heschel wrote it. If we were writing this today, I suspect it would have had different language, but I left it the way he wrote it back in the 60s. The people of Judah had rejected the Torah of the Lord and had not kept his statutes. And the people of Israel, he quotes Amos now, sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of shoes. They that trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and turn aside the way of the afflicted. Man may remain callous, Heschel writes, but God cannot keep silent. Terrible is God's voice, because God has a heart. So let's pause already and ask, what do you see here? What is Heschel saying about God in this little snippet where he quotes the prophet Amos? I saw Amy. Amy, go ahead. Amy Soleil.
I'm on my way. Yeah, God cares and won't hesitate to intervene as necessary.
I don't know about the intervening, by the way, but certainly cares enough to say something, right? So if intervention here means saying something, then absolutely. This is not like Maimonides' God, who is a sort of a neo-Aristotelian unmoved mover outside the world, right? This is a passionate God. This is a God who cares. God, it has a heart. Heschel doesn't seem afraid here of using anthropomorphic language, God as caring and having a heart. I see Nina, and then I see Evan.
Heschel's God doesn't just care. Heschel's God cares particularly about injustice and is always going to react to injustice in some way. I think, no, that's all.
Yeah, great. Right. So injustice sits at the center. What is God caring about? About the people who sell the righteous for silver, right? The people who trample the head of the poor. This is not uncommon in the prophets. This is the description of a society that takes advantage of its vulnerable. That's who God cares about. And in fact, here, I'll jump us to another passage here where he compares God to Zeus. He says Zeus is passionately interested in pretty female deities and becomes inflamed with rage against those who incite his jealousy. The God of Israel is passionately interested in widows and orphans. What is the widow and the orphan? The widow and the orphan, of course, is the Torah's way of saying the vulnerable, those who are vulnerable in your society. Evan, go ahead.
I was going to say from that passage, it dawned on me that God is not sitting by idly, so that God's going to pay attention. And for those that think they can get away with treating others badly and not caring, God's not going to have that.
Right. How you act matters. There is a higher standard. Now, I don't know if all of us here, there's a lot of us here, there's like 100 of us here, right? I don't know if we all share Heschel's particular theology, right? I'm not sure I believe in an anthropomorphized God who has a heart, who cares in this way. And yet the message, the ethical and religious message that Heschel puts forward here is really clear that God cares. And of course, then by extension, we are required to care about the vulnerable. So I see Susan, and then I see Thomas. Go ahead, Susan.
Well, you just stole the thunder. I was just going to say, I was just going to say that even if what you believe in is like predicate theology, it is being God-like to care and to raise our voice when we see injustice.
Yes, I think that's a beautiful way of putting it, right? To care about the vulnerable is a God-like act. Thomas, go ahead.
Heschel helps solve a lifelong conflict for me about spirituality by saying that God is ineffable. And if God is ineffable, giving him these anthropomorphic traits is just, I think, a way of Heschel taking liberty to send a message, because if he's ineffable, you can't really use these traits.
Yep. Right. Yeah. Maimonides, to invoke him again, would have said that our words can't really describe God anyway, right? Our words are simply our words. Maria, go ahead, and then I'm going to move us forward in the text a little bit.
There we go. Okay. The word empathy comes to mind, that in that passage, God is empathizing with the vulnerable. But then I have a question or a thought, which is, I wonder if in the text there is something where God empathizes also with the oppressor. And just as maybe it's not in there, but it's something I think about a lot in terms of when people cause harm or are cruel or oppressive, is there a way to feel some empathy for them and to find a way in for change somehow?
Yeah, I appreciate you raising that. I don't, without studying Heschel more, I don't know what he would say about that. But I think it's a really interesting question, to humanize the person who does wrong, to understand that hurt people, so such as it is, right? And I suspect that if pathos or empathy sits at the center for Heschel, then that would be for all human beings. It would be to understand why people hurt others out of the very, their humanity. What are the various psychological and philosophical and spiritual and reasons that we do harm to each other? I think that must be part of repairing society. I really appreciate you raising that, Maria. And I'll just move us forward a little bit here, where he quotes another passage from the book of Amos. He says, "It was not only iniquity that had aroused the anger of God, it was also piety." And piety here is going to mean false piety, upon which God's words fell like a thunderbolt. Sacrifice and ritual were regarded as the way that leads to the Creator. The men in the institutions dedicated to sacrificial worship were powerful and revered. Came a dresser of sycamores, which is the prophet Amos, from the wilderness of Judah, and proclaimed the word of God. "Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and cereal offerings, I will not accept them. I will not look upon them." Why? What does God want instead? "Let justice well up as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream." So Heschel has teased apart here what we might call false piety, the person who shows piety through public acts of piety, bringing a big expensive sacrifice to the temple, something like that. Keeping kosher, being absolutely sure to keep kosher. Somebody just put the minutia of kashrut of gelatin, right? Does God really care? I mean, Heschel kept kosher his whole life, right? He's not saying don't keep kosher. I'll leave that to each of us individually to decide. But he is saying that you can't have the kashrut of gelatin without thinking about the kashrut of the atomic bomb, right? You can't behave in ways that are quote unquote religiously pious while behaving in ways that are socially unjust. And in the end, for Heschel, and I think this is important for him, he suggests that justice is not only about a sort of a Kantian or Neoplatonic idea in the world. He says that for him, there is a living God who cares. Justice is more than an idea or a norm. Justice is a divine concern. So there's that language of empathy that we raised a few moments ago. For Heschel, justice is about a God who cares about human beings. Now, I know that might be different from some of our theology, but I raise that because I think it's really important in terms of understanding who the prophet is. And ultimately, this comes down to the question of who is the prophet. And here, I'll just read this section from the prophets here. He says, "The divine pathos," by the way, pathos and empathy from the same root, right? which has to do with caring about people. The divine pathos is like a bridge over the abyss that separates man from God. It implies that the relationship between God and man and humanity is not dialectic, characterized by opposition and tension. Man in his essence is not the antithesis of the divine, although in our actual existence we may be rebellious and defiant. The fact that the attitudes of man may affect the life of God, that God stands in an intimate relationship to the world, implies a certain analogy between creator and creature. So this is that idea that to care is to be God-like. And that's why for Heschel it matters that there is a God who cares. It matters that there is a God who has pathos, because that, he says, is a God-like way to act. And when it comes down to it, what is commanded of us in last week's Torah portion is Kedoshim Tihu, you shall be holy, Ki Kadosh Ani Adonai Elohechem, as I, your eternal God, am holy. Sometimes we translate that as you shall be holy because I am holy, but sometimes we can translate it as you shall be holy like I am holy, in ways that I am holy. And so for Heschel, it matters that there is a God who cares, because to be a godlike being, to be a human being living up to our potential, is to care like God cares. Go ahead, Ira.
It makes me think, is man in search of God or is God in search of man? I mean, is God going to intervene, or is he reminding us that we have to be the ones who care?
Yeah, well, Heschel's one of his most famous works is called God in Search of Man. You might have thought it would be the other way around, man in search of God, but no, he suggests God needs us. This is very Hasidic, by the way. God needs us. God needs us to do tikkun, to repair, to do the work of releasing the sparks, to use Kabbalistic language. Kabbalah and Chassidut are very closely related to each other. So Heschel takes what was an old Kabbalistic mystical paradigm of God needs us to do work in the world in order for God to be complete, and he turns it into a social justice paradigm. He says God is calling on us to do the work of repair because God is in search of us. God needs us. So that brings me then to the prophet. And before I show you more texts, let me ask you, let's use the chat for this. What words come up when you think about the prophet? Prophet with a P-H-E-T. What is a prophet? Let's just use the chat here. What's word association with the word prophet? And I see some interesting words here. Messenger, tortured, a bridge. That's, Heschel just used that language. Writings, many of our prophets are literary prophets. They wrote, they wrote books. We have their writings, at least some of them. Reluctant, Jonah is the best example of the reluctant prophet. Nobody wants to be a prophet because, first of all, nobody likes you if you're a prophet. Second of all, if you really do your job well, you make yourself irrelevant. That's why Jonah doesn't want to go to Nineveh, because if he goes and he gets the people to repent, then he will make himself into a liar by having said God's going to destroy the city. Prophet was a lousy job, I think. Forward-thinking, inspired disruptor, one who is connected with God, someone who sees beyond conscious, predictor, one who chastises the people when they do wrong, wow, so many good words here. Conscience, compass, outsider, social activist, clear-sighted. I'm not going to read them all just because there's so much here, but we often think of the prophet as someone who tells the future. We use the word prophecy in English to mean a prediction for the future. But the prophet in Judaism is not really a predictor of the future. The prophet in Judaism is really a social critic. The prophet's job, I like to say, is not to predict the future, but to change the future. That's why Jonah was wrong. Jonah didn't make himself a liar by getting the Ninevites to repent, because his job was never to predict that Nineveh would be destroyed. His job was to prevent the destruction of Nineveh by fomenting social reform, by bringing about the creation of a better society than the one that existed. That's what the prophet is, and Heschel taps into that, asking questions about where does the prophet get their power from. If you think about in the ancient world, think about, for example, the institution of the oracle. You see this in movies. I recently watched The Matrix. Any Matrix fans here? There's an oracle in The Matrix, right? And the oracle in The Matrix channels the truth from somewhere. There's no God in The Matrix. It's not quite the same, but or like Chaos, the recent TV series with Jeff Goldblum. What does the oracle do? The oracle channels the word of the gods, is essentially a vehicle, a vessel for the word of the gods. Heschel suggests that we might have thought that was the case for the prophet as well, but it's not. The prophet, and the prophet is something different than an oracle. And so here, take a look with me. He says, what indeed was the nature of the prophet's transmission of what he perceived? Was it an impersonal reproduction of an inspired message, a mere copy of the contents of inspiration, or did prophetic experience involve participation of the person in the act of transmission or even inspiration? And he says, the prophet is not a mouthpiece, but a person, not an instrument, but a partner, an associate of God. So what could it mean? I'm gonna put that into the chat for a minute so that we can stop the screen share and see each other. What could it mean for a prophet to be a partner as opposed to a mouthpiece, a person versus an instrument? Why does that matter to Heschel? And what might it even look like for the partner to play, or for the prophet to play such a role? I see Jerry. Go ahead, Jerry.
Prophets as human beings are going to bring a message that is influenced by their own humanity, by what they have experienced in life, as opposed to some robot that's controlled by an external force and just has a speaker in it and transmits the words of that external force.
Yes, bringing something of their own being to the experience, I think, is a really important element of this. If we think about the prophet as social change maker, you can already begin to see where Heschel is going here. That the prophet must necessarily bring their own human experience to the encounter with God, to use prophetic language, and also to the work of being an advocate for social justice. That is a human thing to do, not simply a mouthpiece like in a movie. I see Nina, Doreen, and then Bob. Go ahead, Nina.
I think that to be in partnership with God in this way means to act and to be seen acting, not just to exhort people, not just to encourage people, but to model what should be done. In Heschel's time, this was you go and you march with Dr. King. And you tell your congregation and encourage your congregation to do likewise. But the important part is to be doing it and to be seen to do it.
Yeah, so there's a public aspect here of role modeling, and I'm glad you brought up the civil rights movement, because of course Heschel really understood that as an expression of his religious thought. It's not that Heschel thinks of himself as a prophet, but I think he sees the prophet as a sort of a model for all of us, a way, just like the model, like you just said, Nina, that the prophet is meant to model certain behaviors, then the rest of us humans are meant to see the prophet and to understand them as a model for how we should act in our world. Doreen, Bob, and Alfred. Go ahead, Doreen.
I think a big part of what that thing you put up in the chat is abiding with. I think you can tell people and show people all day, but if you don't invite them along and help them have the experience of which they might be uncomfortable or frightened, because unfortunately, a lot of the people we talk about are martyrs. And you're not really inviting your friends to become martyrs. You're just inviting your friends to walk with you, or they want to walk with you because they want to be or experience what you're being or experiencing. And abiding is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Doreen. Another word for that could be leadership. Bob, please, and then Alfred.
Another thing that shows the collaboration, the partnership between the prophet and God is the second part of the Jonah story. After Nineveh is over, the part with the carob tree, which is, after all, the proof text for waiting for Godot.
Right. Afterwards, Jonah gets angry at God for, why didn't I said you were going to destroy the city and then you didn't? You made me look like a liar. And God says, I care about all these people. You care about God builds a gourd, makes a gourd, and Jonah's all happy about it. And then the gourd goes away and and Jonah's upset. And God says, you care about that little gourd. Think about how much I care about all these people in this world. It absolutely is the central message here of what prophecy is about. It's about the caring. I'll show you more about that in just a minute. Alfred, go ahead.
While Heschel didn't consider himself a prophet, in his close friendship with Martin Luther King, they each considered the other a prophet, but denied it about themselves. So one must wonder. The second thing I'd like to say is I think in this discussion, a unifying concept about Heschel is his moral urgency.
I agree.
The word was moral, M-O-R-A-L. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, but well, so there you go.
Yeah, well, Alfred, tell us a sentence more about that. When you say moral urgency, what did it mean for Heschel?
Well, to go to Montgomery and march with King, as he famously said, I was praying with my legs. In the introduction that his daughter wrote to the prophets, she talked about him being sleepless at night, thinking of all the Vietnamese children being bombed. He just had he persuaded Dr. King to come out against the war. He was the force that said, Martin, based on what we believe, you must do this. And he was one of the few, along with Maurice Eisenroth, who stood at Arlington protesting the war with Martin Luther King, for which he got great criticism. The urgency to act is where Heschel is coming.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that famous picture of Heschel and Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, who at the time was the president of the Reform movement, and King, where Eisendrath is holding a Torah. That I'm pretty sure that's from Arlington, right? That was from an anti-war protest versus the civil rights protest. But the three of them marched together, and Selma as well. They saw all of this as an expression of their religious convictions. So this idea that, to go back to Jonah for just a moment, Heschel suggests that the prophet, the reason the prophet is not a mouthpiece but a person is because the prophet shares what he calls God's pathos. He says an analysis of prophetic utterances shows that the fundamental experience of the prophet is a fellowship with the feelings of God, sympathy with the divine pathos, a communion with the divine consciousness, which comes about through the prophet's reflection of or participation in the divine pathos. That's why the prophet is not just a mouthpiece, not just someone that God is speaking through. The prophet is someone who, somebody talked before about bringing their human experience to the experience of the divine. According to Heschel, what the prophet brings to the experience of the divine is pathos, is a deep caring for fellow human beings. That's what allows the prophet to be a prophet, to come into contact with the divine. And in his language, and this I think is really important, in Heschel's language, It's not that God talks to Isaiah. It's not that God sends a message to Amos. God is talking to the world. It's just that only some of us actually hear the message. That's what the prophet is. He writes, the two staggering facts in the life of the prophet are God's turning to him and man's turning away from him. This is often his lot, to be chosen by God and to be rejected by the people. The word of God, so intelligent to the prophet, is unintelligible to them. And then he quotes Isaiah. I cut this down. It's part of a much longer passage. He says, to whom will God impart knowledge? To whom will God convey a message? God will speak to the people, yet they refuse to hear. And to me, I think this is the most powerful two sentences that Heschel ever wrote. What baffles the prophet is the disparity between the power and impact of God and the immense indifference, unyieldingness, sluggishness, and inertia of the heart. God's thunderous voice is shaking heaven and earth, and man does not hear the faintest sound. We are so good at turning away from suffering. We are so good at closing our eyes to things that are wrong, things that need to be fixed, whether it's in our own society or across the world, whether it's people on the other side of the border, whether it be the Israeli-Palestinian border, or people who are trying to enter a country illegally because they're seeking a better life. We human beings are so good at ignoring what Heschel calls God's thunderous voice shaking heaven and earth. We know what's right and wrong, and yet we want to live our comfortable lives. For Heschel, the prophet is the person who cannot live a comfortable life, the one who's up at night, as Alfred said about what Susanna Heschel wrote about her father, up at night worrying about suffering, vulnerable people in the world, who can't help but hear God's thunderous voice and then needs to share it with the world. That's not all of us. And that's probably why Heschel suggested that he was not a prophet, but Dr. King was, that not everybody is that. And yet everybody has the capacity to hear the voice. It's a choice to hear the voice, and it's a function of our particular pathos, of our particular caring for fellow human beings. So I see Amy, and then I see Jerry.
So making me think about Sound of Silence. Can very much feel an anthem of mine, since I've always been trying, according to everything we've been talking through. Like, all right, 1 second. According to that, perhaps that's just to communicate that I'm a prophet of some kind, since I've always been doing as I can to help others improve their understanding about anything and everything. For sake of being succinct, yeah, right, let's stick to queer rights, since I'm one of God's gay children. And something can strike me as boring common sense, and others are like, holy throw, do not run sex ed classes for now. No, I'm not doing that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Right, this responsibility to help others see what you see, right? To help others see what's unjust that you see. Jerry, and then Doreen.
There's so many things wrong with this world. And to the extent that we're partners with God in repairing the world, how does an individual pick and choose and still be able to claim this partnership with God? Because none of us can do it all.
Of course not.
But we may see a myriad of needs. So how does that all get worked together?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's truly a question for an organizer, right? Because how one person can hardly make a change. It feels hard to be the one. It must feel incredibly lonely to be the one who hears God's thunderous voice shaking heaven and earth when nobody else can hear it. And so that's where you get into coalition building. It's where you find like-minded people. But I think, without having the magic answer to your question, I think some of it is to recognize that that is true, that this is lonely work. That, look, nobody loved the prophet in ancient times. Martin Luther King Jr. was widely reviled in certain parts of society. We like to look back and lionize certain people, but I think that they led very difficult lives. And so some of being the prophet, or some of being someone who cares about a just society, is finding opportunities to be with people who share your values, finding opportunities to fill yourself back up from the lonely work, picking and choosing what you can do, because we can't do everything. I don't have the magic answer, but I just think that all of those things are true, which, by the way, that's part of why we're here, right? This social justice series is about bringing together people who share values in a world where it can feel quite lonely to share the values that we hold. So we have only a few minutes left. Doreen and Thomas, go ahead, and then I'm gonna close us out.
Just quick to Jerry, define your passion and your skill, and then look for people who are doing that as well. And you'll find them. You may not find a lot, but you'll find them. And Rabbi Micah, the old social justice saying, I come to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Yep. I love it, right? It's been said about rabbis, it's been said about journalists that, that's the role, is to comfort the afflicted. And we need that, aren't we? Aren't we afflicted, all of us right now in this world that we're living in? And bringing us together brings some comfort, but also we need some affliction. We need a kick in the pants to be reminded that there is a lot of work to do around us. Thomas, go ahead.
Well, one of my other spiritual battles is the phrase Selam Elohim. And I always try to picture, if God is ineffable, how could we consider ourselves created in his image? But in biblical times, Selam could also be a representative. So to work through my spiritual conundrum, I've decided that we're all supposed to be representatives. And anybody that's been a manager will realize that you're going to have some good employees and some not so good employees. Some of us do a better job than others, but I also think we don't necessarily have to think of God seeing us as individuals. God may just see mankind, period. And a oneness that we can't see, but there's a connection to everything. And, if you had the capacity to view it all at once, you might see it differently. We don't have that capacity, but we do our little part as a representative.
Awesome. That's an excellent segue into what I wanted to show you next and last. So Thomas, I'll pay you later for that segue. Heschel, this is from Heschel's 1963 address on religion and race. He gave this talk at the Chicago area conference on religion and race. This is the conference where he met Martin Luther King. Many of you know, they became fast friends after that. They strategized together. They worked together to advance the work of civil rights. In 1963, Heschel was kind of like the Jewish speaker to the warm-up act for King. King, by the way, not universally loved, right? And part of Heschel's goal in this speech was to give a kind of a Jewish justification for Martin Luther King's work, for the idea that that civil rights is God's work, essentially. And the reason that I bring this up is because what Thomas just shared with us, Heschel says almost word for word. He says here, what is an idol? An idol, he says, is any God who is mine but not yours. Any God concerned with me but not with you is an idol. Elsewhere, Heschel talks about the idea of why is it forbidden to build images? Why does the Torah forbid images? You can make images of lots of things, but an image of God is not to be made according to the Torah. And Heschel says because there is already an image of God. The image of God is the human being. We're not to make an image of God because the image of God is right in front of us wherever we look. And so to take care of God is then to take care of human beings. And he actually goes on to say almost exactly what was just said. The Bible says that God created different kinds of plants, different kinds of animals. In striking contrast, it does not say God created different kinds of men of different colors and races. It proclaims God created one single man, one single human being. From one single person, all human beings are descended. And then Heschel adds that to think of man, of human beings, in terms of white, black, or yellow is more than an error. It is an eye disease, what he calls a cancer of the soul. So yes, in his language, God does not see us in different races. Now that's interesting because, of course, we want to be seen for all our differences. And yet there's this vast oneness. The oneness of God is reflected in the oneness of human beings. And Heschel then goes on, and again, one of his most famous passages to say that there is an evil which most of us condone and are guilty of, which is indifference to evil. We think that as long as you're not actively participating in oppressing somebody else, then you're good to go. But Heschel says, no, there are only two kinds of people. There are the slaves of Pharaoh, and there is Pharaoh. And if you're not the one being oppressed, then you are participating in the oppression. Heschel says that to stand by, to be indifferent to evil is just as, in fact, here, I'll show you the text. I know I keep putting it up and taking it back down. He says, indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. It is more universal, more contagious, more dangerous. Most of us don't actively oppress, but it's so easy to just turn a blind eye to people being oppressed. And that's why it is more insidious and more dangerous ultimately. And yet, he says, the greatest heresy is despair. Despair of human beings' power for goodness, for human beings' power for love. And he ends this powerful speech by saying, let there be a grain of the prophet in every person. So ultimately, Heschel, while rejecting the notion that he himself is a prophet, he calls on each of us to find that grain of the prophet in ourselves. He calls on each of us to strain to hear the voice, to hear God's booming, thunderous voice calling out, because it's calling to all of us. It just means that we need to do a little more work to hear it. He calls on each of us to do the uncomfortable work of lifting our voices, of speaking out for what's right, even when it's hard to do that. And he reminds us ultimately that there's no such thing as being neutral when it comes to oppression of the vulnerable. There's no such thing as being neutral when it comes to evil, that you are either the slave of Pharaoh or you are the Pharaoh. And he says, you don't have it in front of you anymore. He says, it is sad to be a slave of Pharaoh. It is horrible to be a Pharaoh. And that's why each of us needs to do the work of speaking out when we see injustice and trying to find the prophetic, trying to find the grain of the prophet in ourselves. So I want to thank you for this discussion. This went fast, and I have about 30 more things I want to talk to you about, but I'll have to wait for another time. We are going to meet one more time in this social justice series on June 16th. That's a date change, by the way. It was originally a week before. It's now June 16th with Rabbi Denise Egger, who's going to teach on Judaism and LGBTQ plus identity in honor of Pride Month. So I look forward to seeing all of you there, and I thank you for being with me today. Take care, everyone.